On Eli Mercer's first night in the house nobody wanted, the wind came through every loose seam except the one place Ranger would not leave alone. The old dog stood in the hallway with his nose pressed to a painted cabinet, breathing in a cedar scent that had no reason to be there. Eli measured the wall, checked the outside, then measured again. 6 feet of house had vanished on paper. In a bowl of unlabeled keys, one flat brass key fit nothing he could see, and Ranger kept tapping the cabinet like he already knew where it belonged. Eli had bought the house because everyone else had walked away from it. It leaned toward the bay as if listening to the tide, with salt-clouded windows, soft porch boards, and gutters full of needles from the crooked pines behind it. The listing called it a coastal fixer with character. The neighbors called it Pike's Folly. Eli did not care what they called it. After leaving the Navy, he wanted a place where the day began with coffee, quiet work, and Ranger's paws clicking across a floor he could repair one board at a time. The real estate agent had tried to talk him into something easier. She pointed out the warped siding, the narrow kitchen, the heating system that coughed awake only when it felt respected, and a hallway so awkward that even the photographer had avoided showing it. Eli listened, nodded, and pictured his tools on the porch. He knew neglect when he saw it. Neglect was not the same as ruin. Sometimes it only meant nobody patient had been willing to stay long enough to ask what a place needed. Ranger made his opinion clear before Eli signed the last page. While the agent explained disclosures at the kitchen counter, the dog wandered down the short hall and sat beside a built-in cabinet under the stairs. He did not whine or scratch. He simply planted himself there and looked back at Eli, ears lifted, tail still. Eli had seen that look on docks, ferries, and repair yards. Ranger used it when a simple thing had stopped making sense. The first clue was not the cabinet. It was the air. Every draft in the house came from some honest failure. A cracked sash, a lifted threshold, a loose bit of trim. But at the base of that hallway cabinet, the air moved in a clean, steady line. It smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and something sharper like old varnish waking up after a long sleep. Eli knelt with his hand against the floor. Ranger nudged his wrist once, then pressed his nose to the lower left corner. By morning, Eli had made a list on the back of an envelope. Roof patch, water heater, porch step, hallway draft. He put the draft last because it seemed least urgent, but Ranger refused to accept that ranking. Every time Eli carried a box through the house, Ranger redirected him by standing near the cabinet. When Eli unpacked plates, Ranger waited there. When Eli opened the front door to haul in bedding, Ranger stayed at his post, patient and certain. Bellwether Cove was the kind of town that knew your truck before it knew your name. By noon, 2 neighbors had waved from the road, one had left a paper bag of tomatoes on the porch, and a retired plumber named Saul had leaned over the fence to ask if Eli had already found the bad pipe. Eli said he had found 5. Saul laughed and said the house liked to choose who learned what first. That line stayed with Eli longer than it should have. The house liked to choose. It sounded like something people said when they had stopped expecting straight answers. Saul told him that the previous owner, Harland Pike, had built skiffs in a rented shed near the harbor before moving his work home. According to Saul, Pike could make a plank bend by looking at it. He also liked privacy and hated wasting materials. Nobody, Saul added, had understood the house after Pike was gone from town. Eli asked whether Pike had built a workshop inside. Saul squinted at the siding, then shook his head. The workshop had been out back, he said, but a winter storm took the shed roof years earlier. The remains were hauled off before the place was listed. As far as Saul knew, the house itself was just odd. Then Ranger barked once from the hallway, not loud enough to alarm anyone, only sharp enough to interrupt. Saul looked toward the open door and lowered his voice. That dog found something, didn't he? Eli did not answer right away. He had learned that saying a strange thing out loud too early made people either explain it away or lean too far into it. Instead, he thanked Saul, went inside, and found Ranger sitting beside the cabinet with one paw on the floorboard seam. The paw was not random. It touched a dark line in the wood, nearly hidden by old finish. Eli wiped it with a rag and saw that the line continued under the cabinet face. The board was different from the others. It was pine like the rest, but the grain ran slightly off, as if someone had replaced it with a piece cut from another room. 2 small plug marks sat near the edge, filled and stained. Eli tapped the board with his knuckle. The sound was hollow for about 3 inches, then solid. He tapped again, slower. Ranger leaned in, listening with him. That was the first time Eli wondered whether the missing space was real. He went outside with a tape measure, hooked it under the rear corner trim, and stretched it along the side wall. 32 feet. Inside, from the kitchen wall to the front room, he counted barely 26. Old houses were full of chases, closets, and odd framing, but 6 feet was not a pipe chase. 6 feet was a room waiting behind a story nobody had bothered to finish. The next 2 days tried to pull him away from the hallway. Rain found a path through a cracked flashing near the chimney. The water heater needed a new valve. A window weight snapped inside the front room wall and made a sound like a box dropping in an attic. Eli handled each repair with the calm method he trusted. Stop, listen, trace the failure, fix the cause. But every time he returned to the hall, Ranger was already there, keeping watch, like the cabinet owed him an explanation. On the 3rd morning, Eli opened the kitchen drawers and found the bowl of keys. Some were modern, some square-shouldered and dark with age. One had a paper tag so faded that the writing had become a soft blur. The flat brass key at the bottom was shorter than the others, with 2 shallow cuts and a tiny stamped letter P. Ranger sniffed the bowl, sneezed, then touched the brass key with the tip of his nose. Eli tried it on the front door, the back door, the cellar latch, the locked pantry, and the small cabinet over the stove. Nothing. He tried it on a trunk in the upstairs room and a padlock on the garden gate. Still nothing. By late afternoon, the key had become an irritation more than a clue. He set it on the hallway cabinet and went to sand the porch rail. Ranger picked it up gently, carried it 3 feet, and dropped it beside the lower hinge. The cabinet did not have a keyhole. That was the problem. It had 2 doors with wooden knobs and paint thick in the corners. Inside were shallow shelves, the kind meant for linens or board games. Eli removed the towels he had just stored there, then ran his fingers along the back panel. It felt smooth, except for one ridge near the bottom. Ranger pressed his shoulder against Eli's knee, not pushing hard, only reminding him to keep going. Pay attention to this next detail because it explained why everyone else missed it. The back panel had been painted the same dull cream as the cabinet interior, but the grain under the paint ran vertically. The side walls ran horizontally. Eli fetched a flashlight and angled the beam low. 3 screw heads appeared under tiny moons of paint. The screws were brass, not steel, and the slots were clean enough to suggest they had been turned by careful hands. He did not open it that night. The rain had returned. The porch repair was half-sealed, and he refused to rush a hidden space in a house he barely knew. Instead, he made soup, fed Ranger, and sat on an overturned crate in the kitchen while the wind worried the eaves. From the hall came the faintest sound, not a knock, not a creak, but a breath passing through wood. Ranger raised his head and Eli set down his spoon. That sound changed the order of the list. Before sunrise, Eli cleared the cabinet, scored the paint around the screws, and backed them out one by one. The panel did not fall. It held tight as if sealed around the edges. He used a flat scraper, then a thin pry bar wrapped in cloth. The bottom loosened first. A stronger cedar scent slipped out, clean and dry. Ranger stood, tail moving once, the way he greeted a door finally opened after a long wait. Behind the back panel was not a room, not yet. It was a second panel, narrower, made of oiled cedar with a small recessed plate in the center. The plate had a keyhole. Eli stared at it, then at Ranger, then at the flat brass key on the floor. He had been wrong about the cabinet. It was not hiding a storage space. It was guarding an entrance built by someone who cared whether the next person had enough patience to find it. The key turned with a soft click. The cedar panel opened inward 2 inches and stopped against something on the other side. Eli pushed gently. A stack of folded canvas had slumped behind it, stiff with age but not damp. He reached through, moved the canvas aside, and the panel swung farther. A narrow passage appeared, just wide enough for a person to turn sideways. Ranger stepped in first, nose high, paws careful. Eli followed with the flashlight. The passage ran behind the stair wall, then opened into the 6 missing feet. The hidden room was longer than he expected, tucked between the kitchen and the exterior wall, with a low ceiling, 2 high vents, and a bench running beneath them. Everything inside looked paused rather than abandoned. Hand planes hung on pegs. Patterns for boat ribs lined one wall. Cedar shavings filled a lidded bin, still fragrant after all those quiet years. For a long minute, Eli did nothing. He had imagined mold, broken pipes, maybe a forgotten pantry. He had not imagined a wooden boat workshop hidden inside a house that had been mocked for being badly laid out. The bench was worn smooth at hip height. A half-finished tiller rested in a cradle. A row of clamps hung in descending order, each marked with a small painted number. On the far wall, a sign made from scrap cedar read, "Make the next useful thing." Ranger moved through the room like he had been invited. He sniffed the bench legs, circled a stool, then sat beside a wooden chest under the vents. Eli checked the hinges, then opened it. Inside were oilcloth packets, notebooks, spare brass screws, and a bundle of letters tied with blue twine. The top notebook had a label in block letters. Landing Room, Bellwether Cove, started by H. Pike, kept for those coming ashore. The phrase made Eli sit down on the stool. Coming ashore. It was ordinary language in a harbor town, but on that page it carried a second meaning. The first entry was not dramatic. Pike had written about sharpening tools, checking vents, replacing the cabinet panel if the hallway paint ever cracked. Then the entries changed. Names appeared, always first names and initials, followed by small tasks: sanded oars, cut shelf brackets, repaired chair, learned to plane cedar without forcing the grain. There was a reason the house had felt less empty than it looked. The room had been used by people who needed work that did not ask them to explain themselves. Pike's notes never pried. He wrote about tea on the bench, radio low, 1 lamp on, 2 hours of quiet making before supper. He wrote that a person who could finish one useful object might sleep better in a room that smelled of wood instead of paint and worry. Eli turned page after page. The notebooks were practical, almost stubbornly so. Vent covers cleaned every spring, wax kept in the tin near the left vise, spare key returned to kitchen bowl only if the person was ready to stop hiding the door from themselves. That line made Eli close the book for a moment. Ranger rested his chin on Eli's knee, as if the dog had brought him to the room and now expected him to keep reading. The letters in the chest came from adults who had spent time there. A former radio operator thanked Pike for teaching him to shape a mast step for a dinghy. A deckhand wrote that she had learned to repair window frames and found steady work at the marina. A supply clerk sent a photograph of a rebuilt kitchen table. No one wrote in grand language. They wrote about hands becoming steady, mornings becoming easier, and the strange comfort of being trusted with sharp tools and patient wood. Eli had not cried when he signed his discharge papers. He had not cried when he packed his apartment into 6 boxes. He had not cried when he drove to Bellwether Cove with Ranger sleeping in the passenger seat and the rest of his life folded behind him. But in that hidden room, reading plain sentences from people who had been offered dignity instead of pity, he had to lower the notebook and breathe until the tightness in his chest loosened. The real question was why the room had been sealed so carefully. Eli searched the bench drawers and found an answer in small pieces. One drawer held labels for cedar planks. Another held receipts from the lumberyard, all paid in cash or trade. The third held a folded plan for the house marked in Pike's neat hand. The workshop was not an accident. It had been designed before the back wall was finished, with vents hidden under exterior trim and a cabinet entrance disguised from casual eyes. In the margin of the plan, Pike had written, "Quiet first, company later." That became the rule Eli carried through the rest of the day. He did not call Saul immediately. He did not tell the town he had found a secret. He swept the floor, oiled the dry hinges, and opened the vents to check the airflow. Ranger lay beneath the bench, content at last, while sunlight entered through the high slats and fell across curls of cedar on the floor. By evening, Eli had learned the room's routine. The vents faced the protected side of the house, which explained the clean draft. The cabinet entrance forced anyone entering to slow down. The bench height suited standing work for long periods without strain. The tool layout made sense even in dim light. Nothing had been built for display. Everything had been built for someone who might need usefulness before conversation. The next morning, Saul came by with a pipe wrench and a loaf of bread from his sister's bakery. Eli met him on the porch and asked what he knew about Harland Pike's visitors. Saul looked at Ranger, then at the hallway behind Eli, and his face changed. He said people used to come by in the evenings, but nobody made a fuss about it. Sometimes their truck stayed for an hour, sometimes 2. Pike would send them home with a repaired stool or a box of offcuts. Saul had never asked questions because Pike did not invite them. Bellwether Cove had respected that. But Saul remembered one thing clearly. Every visitor left through the front door carrying something they had made or fixed. That mattered to him now. He said there was a difference between being handed help and being handed a tool. Pike understood that before the rest of them had words for it. Eli showed him the room after making him wipe his boots. Saul stood in the passage with his cap in his hands, then stepped inside as if entering a chapel without the ceremony. He touched the bench, the clamps, the old sign. When he saw the notebooks, he smiled in a way that made his eyes look both sad and grateful. He told Eli that Pike had always said a house should leave room for the next person's hands. That afternoon, the hidden room stopped being a secret and became a responsibility. Not a burden, exactly. More like a boat found tied to your dock with the oars still inside. Eli could close the door and keep it private. The house was his. The room had waited for him. But every page in the notebooks argued against ownership as a locked box. Pike had built the room to be found by someone who would understand quiet work. Ranger made the decision smaller. He carried one cedar shaving into the kitchen and dropped it beside Eli's boots. Then he returned to the hallway, glanced back, and disappeared through the cabinet entrance. Eli laughed for the first time since moving in. The dog had no interest in legacy, town history, or emotional timing. He knew there was a room that smelled right, a room where Eli's breathing changed, and he wanted the door open. Over the next week, Eli repaired the workshop as carefully as he could. He replaced a cracked vent screen, cleaned the plane irons, sorted the brass screws, and made a new peg for a missing clamp. Each task revealed another small kindness in the design. There was a shelf at knee height for anyone who needed to sit, a stool with a wide base, a kettle plate near the door, a ledger box with blank pages after Pike's final entry. Eli read that final entry 3 times. It was dated years. Pike wrote that the room would seem unnecessary to people who measured value by square footage. He hoped the next owner would measure differently. If the dog finds the draft, trust the dog, he had added at the bottom. Eli looked down at Ranger, who was asleep with sawdust on one ear, and shook his head. The line could have been a joke. It could have been about Pike's own dog, whose name appeared once beside a note about spilled varnish. But to Eli, it felt less like fate and more like proof that practical people notice practical things. Dogs notice air, scent, routine, and gaps where humans see paint. Ranger had not solved a mystery by magic. He had read the house with the tools he had always had. When the first Saturday arrived, Eli carried 2 folding chairs to the porch and opened the front door. He had told Saul he would be working in the shop from 4 to 7. No announcement, no program. If anyone wanted to bring a repair small enough to carry, they could. Saul said he would mention it at the marina. Eli expected 1 person, maybe none. He told himself that would be fine. At 4:15, a woman named Mara arrived with a cracked drawer from the town clerk's office. She said Saul had told her the new owner knew wood. At 4:30, a ferry mechanic brought a stool with 1 bad rung. At 5, a retired Navy cook named Anton came without an object, then admitted he had a cutting board in his truck but did not want to be first. Ranger greeted each person at the hallway, then led them to the cabinet as if checking credentials by scent. Nobody made speeches. That was what made it work. Eli showed Mara how to clamp the drawer square. He gave the ferry mechanic sandpaper and asked him to feel the difference between rough and ready. Anton stood at the bench for 20 minutes before touching the cutting board, then spent an hour planing one edge until it sat flat without rocking. The room filled with quiet concentration, the scrape of tools, and the kind of conversation that starts only when hands are busy. By the end of the evening, the drawer slid clean, the stool stood firm, and Anton's cutting board had a new bevel. Eli wrote the date in the ledger and recorded the repairs in Pike's style, plain and useful. Ranger slept under the bench while 3 adults stood in the kitchen eating bread and tomatoes from the bag someone had left days earlier. The house sounded different with people in it. Not louder, better tuned. Word moved through Bellwether Cove in the way useful news moves through small towns, carried by errands, counters, and open truck windows. Eli refused to call the hidden room a center or a project. It was a workshop. It had hours when the door was open. People could bring a chair, a drawer, a picture frame, a broken oar, or nothing but 2 hands and a willingness to learn. The rules fit on 1 index card. Use the tool you are taught. Finish what you start when you can. Leave the bench ready for the next person. Do not turn someone else's quiet into gossip. Eli pinned the card beside Pike's cedar sign. Saul read it and said Pike would have approved of the last rule most of all. Ranger sniffed the card, unimpressed, then stole a curl of cedar from the floor and carried it to his blanket. The house improved because the workshop did. That surprised Eli at first. He had assumed he would repair the visible rooms and preserve the hidden one. Instead, people who came for the workshop noticed things. Mara brought weather stripping from the clerk's surplus shelf. Anton adjusted the stove vent because it had bothered him all evening. The ferry mechanic found a better latch for the back door. Saul replaced the last questionable pipe, refusing payment beyond coffee and a promise to stop ignoring the cellar. The missing room had made the house whole in a way square footage never could. Once Eli understood its purpose, the awkward hallway became a threshold. The too thick wall became shelter. The strange cabinet became an invitation that asked for patience before entrance. Even the low vents, hidden from outside by old trim, felt less like concealment and more like care. Pike had not hidden the room because he was ashamed of it. He had protected the quiet it offered. One evening, Eli found a loose board behind the bench and discovered a narrow slot in the wall. Inside was a stack of small cedar plaques, blank except for penciled lines on the back. Pike had planned nameplates, perhaps, then decided against displaying names. Eli understood why. The room was not about being seen by the town. It was about being steady enough to step back into the town on your own terms. He used one plaque anyway, but not for a name. He carved 3 words in simple block letters and set it near the cabinet door. Found by Ranger. The dog sniffed it once and sneezed, which Eli chose to accept as approval. Saul said the plaque should be higher, where visitors could see it. Eli left it low, near the draft line, because Ranger was the one who had found the first truth of the house. As autumn settled over Bellwether Cove, the workshop gained a rhythm. Monday evenings were for repairs. Wednesday afternoons, when the light came through the vents cleanest, were for learning tools. Saturday was open bench. The people who came were adults with varied reasons. A marina bookkeeper who wanted to fix her own shelves, a former signalman who liked making small boxes, a ferry pilot who said planing wood helped him think in straight lines. Eli never asked anyone to explain why they needed the room. Some talked eventually. Some never did. He learned that both choices could be respectful. The work itself gave enough shape to the hours. A crooked chair either stood or it did not. A frame either fit square or it needed another pass. Wood did not demand a personal history before accepting repair. Ranger became the unofficial keeper of the threshold. If someone arrived in a rush, he slowed them by standing sideways in the hall until they laughed and scratched his ears. If someone hesitated at the cabinet, he went first. If Eli worked too long without eating, Ranger carried a scrap of sandpaper into the kitchen and dropped it near the pantry, a habit that made no sense, but always worked. The dog did not run the workshop, but the workshop ran better when he was awake. The reveal that stayed with Eli was not the hidden door. It came months later when Mara brought him a box from the county archive. She had found it while reorganizing property records. Inside were old permits, a faded photograph of the house before the porch was enclosed, and a letter from Harland Pike to the town council. Pike had requested permission for an interior workroom with extra ventilation, described as a private rehabilitation workshop for Navy veterans and maritime workers returning to civilian trade. The council had approved it with one condition: no sign, no public funding, no formal schedule that would require oversight. Bellwether Cove had been poorer then and careful about promises it could not keep. Pike had accepted the terms and built the room anyway. In the photograph, he stood beside the unfinished wall with his sleeves rolled and a small dog at his feet. The dog was looking toward the very place where the cabinet would later stand. Eli set the photograph on the bench and felt the story click into place. The house was never a mistake. The odd measurements, the cabinet, the vents, the key in the kitchen bowl, even the misleading layout had all protected a simple idea. People need places where they can become useful again without being watched too closely. Pike had known it. The town had half known it. Ranger had found it with his nose because the air still remembered. That night, Eli wrote a new page in the ledger. He did not try to match Pike's handwriting, only his restraint. House spot in poor shape. Draft found at hallway cabinet. Room opened with key P. Tools cleaned. Door kept open 3 evenings a week. Ranger responsible for discovery and general supervision. He paused over the last line, then added, purpose still sound. The winter gave the room its first real test. Bellwether Cove storms did not arrive with drama so much as persistence, rain tapping every pane and wind pressing against the siding until weak work confessed. Eli spent 3 nights moving through the house with a flashlight, listening for leaks. The hidden room stayed dry. The vents drew clean air even when the kitchen windows fogged. Pike had built it with an understanding of weather that went deeper than carpentry. The room was quiet because it had been engineered to protect quiet. Ranger found the one flaw Pike had not expected. Ivy had climbed the outside wall and packed itself behind the lower vent trim. The airflow thinned, and Ranger noticed before Eli did. He stood in the hallway, then walked to the back door, then returned to the cabinet, repeating the route until Eli followed him outside. Under the wet leaves, Eli found the blocked slat. He cleared it by hand, and the cedar scent returned within minutes. That small repair changed how Eli thought about the workshop. A hidden room could still need ordinary maintenance. A good purpose could fail if nobody cleaned the vent, sharpened the blade, checked the hinge, or kept the path clear. He wrote a maintenance page for the ledger and taped a copy inside the cabinet, low enough that Ranger brushed it whenever he entered. Open vents, sweep shavings, oil hinges, check bench, leave water in the kettle. In late November, Anton brought in a box of worn galley spoons and asked whether wood could be made into handles that fit his grip better. He did not explain why the old handles bothered him. Eli did not ask. They shaped walnut scraps into smooth ovals and tested each one until Anton nodded. Mara sanded picture frame corners nearby. Saul repaired a drawer runner at the floor, muttering that he had become free labor in the best possible way. The room made space for people to enter at different speeds. Some arrived with exact repairs. Some arrived with excuses and left with a task. One man from the marina spent 2 weeks sweeping before he touched a tool, then made a simple cedar wedge and carried it home like it mattered. It did matter. Eli had stopped ranking projects by size. A straight wedge could be the first finished thing a person trusted themselves to make. A few townspeople wanted the room turned into a proper attraction once they heard the story. They imagined a sign, visiting hours, maybe a display case for Pike's tools. Eli understood the impulse. Hidden things tempt people to make them visible. But the notebooks argued for use, not exhibition. He told the town council he would protect the room, document it, and keep the open bench going. A room built for rebuilding people should not become a room people only pointed at. Denise from the Historical Society agreed, but she asked to photograph every tool and page for the archive. Eli allowed it on a Tuesday when the workshop was closed. Ranger watched Denise set up lights and a small camera, deeply offended by cables on his floor. The photographs revealed details Eli had missed: pencil numbers under the clamp rack, a carved arrow on the underside of the bench, and a row of tiny date marks along the door edge. Those date marks opened another loop. Each mark matched an entry in Pike's ledger when someone completed a first project. Pike had not displayed names, but he had marked the door itself with time. Eli ran his fingers over the shallow cuts. They were not trophies. They were proof of continuity, private enough to protect the people, visible enough to remind the room what it had done. Eli added no new cuts for several weeks. He was afraid of pretending the room was his to continue in that exact way. Then Mara finished rebuilding the clerk's drawer, returned it to the office, and came back with a second drawer from her own kitchen. She said the first repair had changed how she looked at broken things. That evening, after everyone left, Eli made a small mark on the inside door edge and wrote the date in the ledger. Ranger sat beside him during the cut, solemn for once. Eli showed him the tiny line as if the dog might inspect the workmanship. Ranger sniffed it, then pressed his nose to the gap where the draft came through. That was his answer to ceremony. The mark mattered, but the air mattered more. Keep the room breathing, keep the door working, keep the bench ready. In December, a box arrived from a marine salvage shop 3 towns north. Inside were patterns for a 12-foot skiff wrapped in brown paper and addressed to Harland Pike years earlier. A note from the shop owner said they had found the package during a storage clean-out after hearing about the Bellwether workshop. The patterns were incomplete, but one rib template matched the half-finished tiller on Pike's bench. Eli spread them across the floor while Ranger stepped carefully between the lines. The skiff became the workshop's long project, though no one called it that at first. Eli used it as a teaching tool: how to read a curve, how to transfer a pattern, how to mark waste wood without wasting good wood. The project gave the regulars something that belonged to all of them, without belonging to any one person. A boat shape slowly appeared in pieces, not ready for water, not even close, but real enough to pull people back. Saul found cedar planks in a shed behind his sister's bakery, leftovers from a porch job. Mara donated a box of bronze screws from the town maintenance closet after checking the inventory twice. Anton brought a kettle that could stay in the workshop. The ferry mechanic made a rack for patterns so no one had to kneel on the floor. Each contribution solved a practical problem, and because it solved a problem, nobody had to make it sentimental. One icy evening, Eli arrived late after getting held up at the hardware store. He expected the workshop to be dark. Instead, he found the kitchen warm, the cabinet open, and 3 regulars inside waiting without starting. Ranger trotted past them with the authority of a host who had already approved the gathering. Eli realized then that the room no longer depended solely on his own steadiness. It had begun to teach a routine to the people around it. That did not make him less responsible. It made him more careful. He created a second key and gave it to Saul only after writing the decision in the ledger. He labeled emergency shutoffs, installed a smoke alarm near the kitchen entry, and kept the sharpest tools in a locked chest when the bench was unsupervised. Trust did not mean carelessness. Pike had known that. The room's gentleness came from order, not from a lack of rules. The biggest change in Eli came quietly. He stopped describing the house as the place he bought because it was cheap. He started saying it was the place Ranger chose. At first, he said it as a joke. Over time, it became a simpler truth than the one he had told himself. He had wanted a place to disappear, but Ranger had led him to the one part of the house designed to bring people back in. On New Year's morning, Eli took down a strip of damaged trim in the hallway and found pencil notes on the back. Pike had written measurements, yes, but also reminders. Make cabinet ordinary. Keep threshold low. Let the draft tell the truth. Eli held the trim in both hands, standing in the cold hall while Ranger leaned against his leg. The hidden room had never needed a sign because Pike had left its invitation in air, scent, and usefulness. That became the story Eli told only when someone had earned the longer version. He would show them the old trim, the brass key, the blue-tied letters, and the marks on the door edge. Then he would hand them sandpaper or a clamp and put them to work. Wonder was allowed in the room, but it had to share space with doing. Otherwise, the workshop became a tale instead of a tool. The first time the rebuilt skiff frame left the hidden room, Eli worried the move would make the project feel too public. 4 adults carried it through the cabinet entrance, across the kitchen, and onto the porch, turning with slow care at every corner. Ranger walked ahead, then behind, then ahead again, unable to decide which position mattered most. Outside, the cedar curves caught the afternoon light. Neighbors passing the road slowed, but no one crowded the porch. They seemed to understand that a thing could be shared without being claimed. Eli used that day to teach the difference between restoration and replacement. A cracked rib could be repaired if the grain still held. A warped piece could sometimes be steamed back toward its old line. But a part that could no longer do its job had to be remade without pretending it was the same piece. The lesson sounded like woodwork because it was woodwork. Still, several people in the porch light went quiet in a way that told Eli the point had landed elsewhere, too. When the frame returned to the hidden room, the house seemed to accept the larger purpose without complaint. The hallway cabinet closed as neatly as ever. The porch smelled faintly of cedar for days. Ranger resumed his post by the draft line, satisfied that the room could open to the world and still remain itself. Eli wrote one sentence in the ledger that night. Useful things can travel and still know where they belong. By spring, the house nobody wanted had become the house people checked on, not with pity and not with nosiness. They came with hinges, tea, dull chisels, bent drawer pulls, and small projects that took longer than expected because conversation found its way into the corners. The porch no longer sagged. The windows opened clean. The hallway cabinet still looked ordinary when closed, which Eli liked. A useful door did not need to announce itself. One clear morning, Eli carried the half-finished tiller from the hidden room to the porch. It had been waiting since Pike's time, shaped but not sanded, labeled only with a penciled T. He set it across 2 sawhorses and worked slowly while Ranger slept in the sun. The cedar warmed under his hand. By afternoon, the tiller was smooth enough to take oil. Saul stopped at the fence and asked what it was for. Eli looked toward the harbor where small boats rocked against their lines and said he did not know yet. That was true, but it no longer bothered him. Not every useful thing had to reveal its destination before the first coat of oil. Some things were made because making them kept a promise alive. Some rooms were found because a dog refused to leave a draft alone. Some houses waited years for the right kind of quiet. On the evening he finished the tiller, Eli opened the ledger and wrote the date. Ranger sat beside him, nose lifted toward the cedar vents. The air moved through the room in that same clean line out of the wall across the bench, past the old sign, and into the hallway. Eli understood then why the house had seemed to breathe. It had been holding its purpose behind painted wood, waiting for someone willing to measure twice, listen longer, and trust the dog. When visitors ask about the missing room now, Eli does not begin with the hidden panel or the brass key. He begins with Ranger in the hallway on that first night, refusing to move from a cabinet everyone else had walked past. He tells them the house looked unwanted because its best room could not be seen from the road. Then he opens the door, lets the cedar air drift out, and watches their faces change. The room was never missing. It was waiting to be useful again.